I'm so excited to introduce our author, Erin Crosby Eckstine, and her novel, Junie. I'll give a brief introduction of Erin Crosby Eckstine right now. Junie is a 16-year-old slave who lives in the Bellarine cotton plantation in Lowndes County, Alabama. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Okay. In the summer of 1860, the enslaved teenager spends her days working as a house servant tending to the needs of Violet McQueen, the red-headed daughter of the plantation's white owner. Junie illicitly wanders the local woods at night, mourning her recent deceased older sister Minnie. With the arrival of a wealthy family from Louisiana, one of whom may be a suitor for Violet, Junie fears she may be taken away from the only place she has ever known to continue to be Violet's maid. To avoid this, Junie commits a desperate act that raises Minnie's ghost from the grave and propels Junie down a dangerous path towards liberation. I hope I made it juicy so you can want to read the book. Thank you. Drawing on her own family's history as outlined in a note at the end of the book, Ms. Eckstine offers a compelling portrait of the psychological, emotional, and social degradation of slavery. We will find out more as we meet the author. So about the author, I want to tell you a little bit about her. Erin Crosby Eckstine writes speculative historical fiction, personal essays, and anything else she's in the mood for. She was born in Montgomery, Alabama, and grew up between the South and also in Los Angeles, before moving to New York City to attend Barnard College. Ms. Eckstine's has worked in a variety of digital media internships and jobs before pivoting to education and then earning a master's in secondary English education from Stanford University. She is well credentialed. Erin Crosby Eckstine went on to teach high school English in Brooklyn, New York. My wife's from New York. She's from Brooklyn. Do or die, Bed-Stuy. For 6 years before becoming a full-time writer. Her novel, Junie, was a Good Morning America book club pick in February. So yes, that is wonderful. When she's not writing, Miss Eckstine is usually making pottery, reading, cooking, or playing The Sims. She lives in Brooklyn with her partner and her cats. Yay! Ms. Eckstine will be in conversation with Miss Shannon Sanders. So we are extremely fortunate to have Miss Shannon Sanders, a writer, attorney, and the author of a short story collection. My son just graduated from law school, and he told me, "Dad, I'm a lawyer. I won't be an attorney until I pass the bar." So that's the difference, right? So she's written a short story collection called Company. Ms. Sanders' short story fiction was a recipient of the 2020 Penn Robert J. Dow Short Story Prize for Emerging Writers and has appeared in several publications including One Story, Tri-Quarterly, Joyland, Electric Literature, and others. Ms. Sanders lives in Silver Spring, Maryland with her husband and 3 sons. Please help me welcome warmly Erin Crosby Eckstine in conversation with Miss Shannon Sanders.
Thank you so much. Ooh, this is a little bit loud. And welcome, Erin.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this is your first book festival, and this is such a great one to come to, and we are getting such a lovely day for it. I am really excited to talk about this book. Congratulations. It is such a triumph.
Thank you.
And I wondered if you would start by reading for us a little bit.
Sure. I can do my old high school English teacher thing and read. Yep, let's do it. All right. So I'm just going to read from the beginning because that feels like a good place to start off. Yeah. All right. So let me just get to the right one. So here we go. Junie wakes up in the red mud, listening to the water that slithers between the rocks in the creek. The faint first light of sunrise slips through the gray moss tangled between the black oak branches. The sunshine's needle points warm her bare legs as mud cools her from below. The earth's smell is enchanting after the rain, sharp, metallic, and sickening if you inhale too long, like copper pots on a humid day. The mud takes what should be hard and makes it soft, what should be finished and makes it raw. The distant crack of the foreman's whip tells her she's not where she's supposed to be. She can't get to her feet fast enough. Instinct makes her rub the wrinkles out of her moth-eaten nightdress, but in doing so, she coats it in caked red mud until she is crimson-streaked like Granddaddy's pants after he slaughters a pig. The whip cracks again. There's no time to fix it. August humidity swarms her like yellow jackets. She runs, trying to ignore the pounding in her head and the stinging in her bare feet from stepping on cracked twigs and pointed rocks. The woods are thinning out now. She can see the field and the sun through a gap in the trees. She holds her hands up, measuring the sun's distance from the field line. It sits on the horizon like a freshly cracked yolk, and on days as hot as this one, the McQueens won't wake for breakfast until the sun's at least a half hand above the horizon. She has to make it to breakfast. She can't be late for breakfast. She promised Bess she'd help with the laundry, and knowing Bess, she's been out since before day. It's another mistake, another lapse, another failure. Junie starts running again. Belrain Plantation, owned by the McQueen family, is stripped bare to make room for the cotton fields, but the woods that frame the edges stay thick up to the banks of the Alabama River. She's memorized these woods as well as anyone can memorize something alive enough to change. Where the best blackberry bushes grow for Auntie Marilla's cobbler, the squeal of the squirrels make when the hawks start circling, the creeks that sprawl like veins from the river, which hide the best skipping stones. Belrain is the only home she's known in her 16 years. Sometimes when she's running, she imagines that the branches and roots bend, allowing her to slip through, like they know her too. The whip cracks again, this time too close to be the foreman's. Someone else is in the woods. It's still too far to the cabin for Junie to make a run for it. She can't stay on the ground. She has to get out of sight. She searches for a branch low enough to catch and hauls herself up onto the nearest oak tree, wincing as the bark cuts into her clammy palms. She climbs past layers of Spanish moss until the spider webs of dried plants hide her from the rusty forest floor, then leans her weight onto the trunk and covers her mouth with her blood-speckled palm. She's done some foolish things in her life, but falling asleep out here has got to be one of the worst.
Thank you so much. And for those who haven't read the book yet, which hopefully everyone will, would you give us a little bit of an introduction to it? So we heard kind of what it's about, but can you tell us a little bit about how this book came to you and what made it into a project that you wanted to see through to the product that we see now?
Sure. So Junie is very loosely based on one of my own family stories. My grandmother was really our family storyteller and kind of the keeper of our family lore. And she used to always just repeat so many different family stories. And one of them was the story of my ancestor, Jane Cotton, who escaped from slavery in Alabama. And I'm not going to give away too much more than that because then it gets into spoilers. But I was visiting my grandparents way back in 2018. I was just down there for Easter. And my grandmother retold this story, and my whole childhood, I'd always focused on a completely different detail of the story, but I all of a sudden started really thinking about just the nature of that escape and how harrowing that must have been, what would drive someone to the point of doing what she did. And that is really what kind of got my gears turning and thinking about writing something. Not that long before that, I'd read Isabel Allende's House of the Spirits, which is still one of my favorite books, and I think was very inspired by how Isabel Allende really wove together her own sort of female ancestor lineage into this magical realist story. And initially when I was writing Junie, that's kind of what I thought I was going to be doing. But honestly, this first ancestor character is the one who her story kept unfolding and unfolding and unfolding, and then it ended up becoming what this is now, becoming Junie as it is and being her own story. So that was really what got me started. And then I think I was really interested in the concept of creating a enslaved character that felt like an enslaved character I personally had not seen in literature or read. I think that a lot of the times, at least in my experience, a lot of the enslaved characters I'd always seen in books, it was either the full-on Gone with the Wind version, where we're out here everybody's so happy to be here, or you're on the flip side, and it felt like while the flip is much more accurate, it does feel like in a lot of cases, a lot of the books I've read that depict enslaved characters who are just going through non-stop, intense physical suffering. In a way, I feel like a lot of those stories often lose some of the sort of inner life of those characters, and also lose a lot of the sort of emotional stuff that's going on. The thing I always really thought about was just that people lived their entire human existences under this system. It was a 250-year history in the United States. This isn't just it was the entire spectrum of the human experience was happening, and that's really what I wanted to kind of sit with in Junie when I was writing it and think about.
Yeah, and I'm going to be very careful about spoilers here, and so many of my questions are going to be about how you approach different things that we know are elements of the book. But I want to follow up on something that relates to what you just said. Earlier this week, we saw a news story about Nottoway Plantation in Louisiana, which is one of the last remaining antebellum monuments, and it burned down. And plantations have such a significance in our national imagination in one way or the other. You know, people have so many things that they attach to the idea of that as a setting.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask about Belrain and how it's almost a character in the book, as setting often is, right? Can you talk about how you developed it and how you thought about, presenting the idea of this place that is so steeped in history? It's in a state of transition as we see it in the book, a little bit like what we, like in Gone with the Wind, which you mentioned already. And just, everything that went into making that place feel real.
That's great question. I think there were slight differences in terms of like the landscape of Belrain versus the house. I think I kind of thought about those somewhat differently. A lot of the landscape and thinking about just what it physically looked like outside, I really based on sort of just my own childhood experiences in Alabama to some extent. The town where my family's from is just like really out there. Like there is nobody, you blink and you miss it. It's mostly fields. There ain't nothing going on. And my family has lived in this town since my ancestor escaped slavery. So my mom literally still lives there. Like every week, we're really still there. And so I based a lot of my experiences of that setting on just being out and about in the dirt, basically, with my granddaddy so much as a kid, and just my experiences of nature in Alabama. So a lot of the outside setting was very much steeped in just like those experiences from my own childhood. But in terms of the house itself, I think I really thought a lot about this sort of like mythology of the plantation house and the notion of this like claiming of land. I read Gone with the Wind while I was working on this. And one of the things, of course, that really comes across in Gone with the Wind is just how much they mythologize like Terra as this place and how amazing, this just like incredible like testament to so many things. And I really wanted to think about, okay, but like, what does this look like from the perspective of the people who are being held there against their will? Like, what is the perspective of this place when you're thinking about it from the people who are forced to work the land and are forced to live here, but also it's their only home, so it's complicated. And I wanted to just kind of dig into the sort of like horror side of those spaces and just sort of the looming sort of terror that exists underneath these sort of like very stark white facades that these houses always had. And I did a lot of like looking into what other houses looked like and just kind of sitting with thinking about how they're just like presented and all of that. And it's weird, being even from the South, it's strange to see the ways in which even black people will sort of like love the aesthetic of like this, like that southern plantation house or that southern like vibe, but then it's also like so intensely interwoven with like our own oppression. So there was a lot that I was kind of thinking about and trying to put that together and really make the house in and of itself like a character, and then also make the house like of such a looming importance to certain characters, and connected to their identities.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And so along those lines, I want to talk about Junie herself, the eponymous character. So there are a few things about her that are really of significance in the novel. One is her age. She's a teenager. In many ways, this is a coming-of-age story because there is a lot that she doesn't know and that she is learning as things are happening to her. Her skin color is of note as it relates to what's going on around her, and that has to do partly with the fact that this is a plantation in transition, right? Her personality. Can you talk about how you developed that character and also decided that she was the person to tell this story?
Sure. So Junie herself, I wanted to write a character that I felt like got to be kind of a mess. And I think it's interesting. One bit of feedback I've seen sometimes with this book is people being really frustrated with the fact that Junie is so like chaotic. And I made her a little bit chaotic and a little all like I gave her a lot of flaws, but also so many like dreams and ambitions. I wanted her to feel really complex. And I did that for a few different reasons. One, I taught high school for 6 years, so I spent like all of my time around 16-year-olds and teenagers. And the reality that I personally sat with was the fact that while our societal expectations of teenagers have obviously changed since that time period, the brain development of a teenager has not changed since that time. So I really spent a lot of time thinking about like, well, how would a 16-year-old perceive of this situation? Like, how would a 16, like, they have no impulse control. Like, they do wild, they talk back to adults. They act a fool. Like, I've seen it all. So I was like, I'm going to weave that into my character. And on top of it, too, I think I really wanted to write a black girl character who, like, got to not quite have it together. Like, I think that there's so often this depiction or this expectation that, like, black women and black girls, like, children, must be, like, strong, know what you're supposed to do, have everything figured out, make the right decisions, do all of these different things, when in reality, it's like, no, she's a kid. She's a 16-year-old girl, and just because she's living under harrowing circumstances, why are we putting the expectation on her to be the one who has to have it together? Like, she's the one being oppressed in the circumstances. So I really wanted to write a character to me that felt like a teenager, and I wanted her to feel like she had this complex inner life, that she had things she wanted for her life, even though life was, she was also in circumstances where she didn't, obviously it was going to be very hard for her to access any of the things that she might want. And yeah, that was a lot of what I thought about. I really wanted to write a character who just felt full and complex and messy and confused and naive. I wanted her to really have all of that, so that also by the end we can see her grow and learn and change. Like, I wanted her to feel like she was going to be dynamic by the end as well, and that we learn alongside her.
Yeah, and you said chaotic, but I mean, I would argue good chaotic, and chaotic in, like you said, an accurate way, a way that is really true to a character in that stage of development. And her friendship with Violet is so much a core of this story. And right away from the time that friendship is introduced, we see kind of the way that their dialogue plays out, sort of the ease that they have with each other, even though there is obviously this huge imbalance in the relationship. And I always find it really interesting to see how friendships are depicted on the page. Can tell us a little bit about setting up that friendship and also about writing it?
Yeah, interestingly, Violet is always the character I say was the easiest one to write. I feel like she kind of like wrote her own dialogue in a lot of ways. I felt like she just kind of came together. But I knew going in, once I realized that Junie was going to be in this maid situation, the thing that it really made me think about was just how closely these people's lives were and how intertwined these house servants were with the masters, basically, and with the white people, because they were literally there all of the time. They were taking care of them. They were raising their children. They were doing all, there was as intertwined as you could possibly be, really. And it was actually quite common historically for black enslaved children to, like, grow up as playmates with the white kids, and then when it came to, like, a particular age threshold, it was sort of like, okay, well, now, either y'all going off in your separate directions or you're the maid now. And so I wanted there to be in their relationship this notion of, like, they'd had that basis of childhood friendship and they have known each other their entire lives. So there is this, like, intrinsic, like, closeness between them that you really can't, that just would develop between two people who grew up together and, like, literally live in the same house pretty much. But at the same time, we also see that they've now reached the age threshold where, like, the societal expectations and this, like, insane caste system that they live under are going to send them in completely opposite directions and now put Violet suddenly in this, like, wild power position in their friendship. And I knew I wanted that to be there for a while, and I also knew consistently that I wanted Violet to be very authentic. I wanted their friendship to be authentic, and I wanted Violet to authentically see Junie as her friend. Like, I did not want it to be a situation where it was a facade. I wanted it to really be that there was authenticity to their relationship. But that a lot of what I wanted to explore, too, was, like, when push comes to shove, what happens with Violet's privilege? How does Violet use her power? How does she use her relationship to others? Like, how does she use her status when push comes to shove, or when it puts her in a difficult position, or like how does that start to change? That was really what I wanted to explore in that relationship.
I'm just curious, your ancestor who inspired the book, was she in that role?
I have no idea. So we know pretty little about her time we actually don't know anything about her time when she was enslaved. The earliest thing that I know about the ancestor is just the escape. So this particular, my aunt, we call her Grandma Jane in my family. And Grandma Jane lived to be like well over 100 and only died because she got hit by a horse and buggy. Yeah, she was active. She was wild. But so part of the reason why her like story endures so long is because she lived such a long time. But she essentially, from what I've been told by family members and like my grandma and different things at different times, she really didn't talk about being enslaved for obvious reasons. But once she got really old, she apparently started having flashbacks. And that was not good. But we don't know anything about really her status. Part of the reason I went with having Junie be a maid specifically was because I was interested in the relationship, the very forced close relationships between white people and black people and under these circumstances. Like I knew that was what I was interested in exploring, was how do these power dynamics work with people who are like literally like the people who are, putting on your dresses every day. Like how is that working? So I knew I wanted that to be there. It was also to some extent too because a lot of my older family members were maids. Like my grandma was a maid in high school. That was her, like she was a maid to a white family in high school. I think my great, like innumerable of my relatives on that side were like the help style maids. And so I think in some ways that was a place where I could like weave that part of the family story.
The help, like as in the book, The Help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was that era. So yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that is so interesting. And so sticking with Junie before I pivot, because I want to ask a lot about this sort of speculative and slipstream aspects of the book. Literacy, her love of literature, poetry. Now that I know that you're an English teacher, I think this makes a lot more sense. But it plays a really big role in the book. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I definitely comes from my own teacher background self. But a lot of it too, I think of her love of books for a few different reasons. One, it just goes against type, I think. I was really interested in the idea that, of course, enslaved people were not allowed to read, like generally across the board. That said, one thing that I think is really interesting within the history of slavery is that really it was ultimately at the end of the day, it was like whatever the master wanted to have happen is what happened. So if the master was cool with you reading or they found it to be useful to them in some way, they'd let you read. Like that's why we have they were literate people. It really came down to essentially that like the slave master was basically God, and essentially however they were ruling over the situation was what was going to happen. So to me with Junie, she can read, but it's not like she can read for like benevolent reasons. It's like she can read because Violet wants a playmate who can read because Violet likes to read. She's like, I would like to shape my friend to be the ideal playmate, so I'm going to teach her how to read. So that was a lot of it, but when we of course see that with the ability to read, Junie does her own thing. I also definitely wove in a lot of the literacy and the reading. I wove in that ability to read too because of just like my family's own love of reading. My grandmother was a massive reader. She's the person who really made me love reading. She's the person who like is absolutely the reason I am sitting here now. And so I think I really wove in that love of literature as well because it was a bit of a way to have it be once again connected to my grandmother and to sort of who we are in our bookishness.
Yeah, I love that. That is such a powerful legacy. That's true in my family, too, that it's very much, there's school teachers back there,
Yeah.
and then the love of books is just so, it's just so foundational and bedrock. And switching gears a little bit, when there is a book that has speculative elements to it, there are kind of a couple ways that can be introduced. So either the writer can set it up very elaborately and say, in this book, you're going to encounter ghosts, and here's background and prologue that explains, what the rules of this slipstream reality are, or the writer can just sort of set the reader into this situation and say, "There's ghosts, deal with it," right? And the latter is kind of what's done here. So I have a couple of questions about this, but I wanted to ask first about that choice.
So I think a lot of that came down to just sort of like the magical realist style. I've always really loved magical realism. And within magical realism, they are the whole genre it's very matter of fact about supernatural or speculative elements. It's, if you read like Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, it's literally just like a dude with wings showed up and everybody's like, all right. And that's pretty much what happens. And so I kind of wanted it with Junie to not be quite as matter of fact as that, but still also not be like, we live in a world with, like, I didn't want it to be all of that. And I do think that I wanted it to feel sort of like that the spirits were very intertwined with the world, and I wanted it to feel like they were, that it was all kind of existing within a similar sort of like realm and connection. So that was, I think, why I wanted it to not feel like it was such like a big fantasy world type change.
Yeah. It feels like there's something that's very appealing about having historical fiction dabble in that slipstream reality. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do too. I love the combination in other people's books. Like there's just so many other books that I've read that dig into like going through family histories or going through histories and then weaving in so much of that. But I also think it's because in some ways family lore and folklore tend to sort of like come together in such an interesting way, and that's why. And in a lot of cases, when a family story gets repeated so many times, it starts to become larger than life and shift and change. And I think that folklore is similar and the speculative is similar, so it all sort of weaves. It felt to me, at least, like a kind of naturally mixed together in some sort of way.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, and it creates a certain experience for the reader, but I think also for the writer, there's a lot of, there's something about it that's, maybe it's very freeing, or you get a certain permission, I think, because you're dealing with a reality that is very separate from your own, to not be so tethered to the rules of the reality that we live in, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I want to pivot here a little bit and talk about just generally the process of writing the book and your process as a writer. So one thing that didn't get mentioned in my bio is that I actually have a novel coming out next year that is set largely, that is like maybe 2/3 of it is set in historically in a small community outside of Memphis and around like kind of based loosely on the Dedrick plantation.
Yeah.
And I found that writing historical fiction, the research process in so many ways was so intimidating and there were so many obstacles that I felt like I had to clear to get words on the page. And once I did, it was very satisfying, obviously, but I wonder if you can talk about challenges that you faced in doing that, anything really interesting that you learned, or any way that you looked at that process differently at the end.
Sure. So I will let you know I had a light cheat code on the historical research, which is that my mom's a historian. So not of American history, but my mom has a PhD in history, which like whilst she actually studies something completely different, she definitely is like, I will dabble in all the things. So my mom was definitely really helpful with a lot of various historical details, particularly for like Alabama history and things in the area. So that was great. Some of the research, when I was going through research, I really tried to, I'm kind of more on the historical fiction end, where like I'm more interested in the fiction part than the historical part in a lot of ways. Like obviously I don't want to be doing anachronisms left and right, and I don't want it to be wrong. But at the same time, I'm more interested in the overall arc of the story and then ensuring that the historical details fit within the arc that I'm doing, versus like I'm not really trying to just take something that happened in history and fictionalize it. Like, I don't really want to do that. So for me, a lot of my research focused on just finding very specific things that were going to fit into elements of the story and add to it. In terms of my research, I did spend a lot of time learning about specifically Antebellum, Alabama, and Antebellum, Montgomery. I really wanted to focus on like what was Montgomery like directly before the Civil War. So that I could just kind of nail that level of detail and kind of get that down. There's a couple things that happen in the book that I did learn in my research without giving this isn't actually that big of a giveaway. At one point in the story, there is like a ball, like a dance, and I did that because I learned that they used to have balls like that in Montgomery at the time. And that was something that definitely just came directly from research. There's another moment in the book that also came from research that was like a very harrowing thing that I'm not going to say because it's a spoiler. But definitely felt like there were those moments in research that I pulled together. Yeah, the researching part it's weird. It's a lot. It is still daunting. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
I got stuck for a year in my draft just not wanting to figure out like this one detail about
That's
something
so
that
real.
happened. And
That's very real.
And then of course it became like a half a sentence in the final draft,
Also
So,
classic.
yeah.
Also, you really will be stopping writing for like over some detail that you're like, what?
Why
All
did I
right,
do that?
I guess. Why not?
Our time has flown by a lot faster than
know.
than anyone would have ever guessed. But I do have I have a final question I
Yeah,
wanted to ask
totally.
before we go to the Q&A, which is that the only reason that I don't spend all of my time playing The Sims now is because I have 3 little kids. But when I saw that you were a Sims player, I
Sure
just wanted
am.
to ask, because I have a theory that something about The Sims very deeply touches people who have a writer's spirit and vice
yeah.
versa. Can you, what do you think about that theory?
Hard yes. Very much agree. I make my settings in The Sims. So I have a tendency to, when I'm working on books, I will literally try to make the setting in The Sims because it's an easy way of visualizing them. Same thing sometimes with characters. I did make all the characters in Junie in The Sims once. I have done it. But I totally agree, and I think it's because ultimately that game is just like open free creation and the form of setting and like characterization. So it becomes. I've been playing The Sims since like The Sims 1. Like I was really 9 playing The Sims. My stepmom was like terrified that something was wrong with me and that I was a sociopath because I kept drowning all my Sims in the pool. Like genuinely was very concerned about my mental. She was like, "Oh my God, she won't stop doing it." And then she realized, and then she figured out that everyone does that in
That's
The
like
Sims.
one of the chief pleasures
It's
of the
like
game.
the like main thing you did in The Sims back then. But yeah, so I still I'm locked in. I'm 32. I still am absolutely playing The Sims. So ain't nothing changed.
I would love to find out if any audience members have any questions for Erin.
Hi, I had to dig in the archives because Erin has been on my book club, so I feel like I've asked every question. But another thing that I am wondering with Junie, how did you go about still capturing Black excellence in a slave story? It was just so, you talked about the ball a little bit, and of course Junie being well-rounded, but you still got that regalness that we bring to things even through hardship.
That's a great question. I think in a lot of ways, to be honest, most of the characters, particularly the older characters, are very, very directly based on some of my own relatives. So in a lot of ways, I think when I was trying to capture that, at least in those particular characters and that sort of sense of like excellence that comes through, I think it was really me trying to just capture real people that I had in my life and trying to put on the page their own sort of the greatness that they themselves exuded. So like the granddaddy character, I'll be honest, the granddaddy character is like a dead ringer from my actual granddaddy. I'd changed barely nothing. I didn't change it, like almost everything. Like if that character does it, like that's exactly, I didn't change anything about, that's basically Joe Crosby. But I really did still, I think it also comes back to what I just cared about doing in this book overall, which is just that really creating these like characters that felt like they were complex. I wanted to have characters who therefore did have like excellence and greatness in areas where they truly and clearly excelled, in addition to areas where they had flaws. I wanted it all to be there.
Hi, thank you for being here, Erin. My question for you is, so we're in Maryland, very close to DC, and there's a lot going on in terms of book banning, and like the Librarian
Really?
of Congress was fired, and, and artifacts are being removed from the African American Museum. Just in case you've been off your phone under a rock somewhere, I wanted to keep you like abreast to what's happening.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And so my question is, and to you too, Shannon, the way that you are both centering the Black experience and making sure that we are aware of history, how do we continue to amplify your work, and what can be done to make sure that we are combating those that are attempting to erase history?
What a great question.
Very great question. So I think that like the reality is like you can't really erase you can't really erase history. Like, it happened. I don't know why, like, you throwing out the books and trying to hide it, it's like, it doesn't change that it happened. It's going down. It happened. And I will be completely honest that, like, when after the election, I was really, really worried knowing my book was coming out, because I was like, oh my God, like, I wrote the book that is everything that these people hate. And I was definitely concerned about it. But I also think at the same time that even more so, it's important to continue to fight to have these stories told and to be very clear about them. And to continue to just have them publicized as much as possible, because it's like, yeah, we're not going anywhere. We always been here. The story is what it is. Y'all did do the things you did, so it is what it is. Like, that's just the situation. So I do think it is really important to continue to amplify the stories as much as possible, because as unfortunate as it is, the reality is that, like, people don't buy books by Black women as much as they buy books by other people a lot of the time. People do not buy books about slavery the way that they'll buy books about other things. And, like, I have myself encountered it in a lot of ways thus far, even in just the 3 months my book has been out, of just noting the ways in which people be like, I'm sure it's good, but I'm not reading that. Or people wanting to, not engage with that, not wanting to, for a lot of reasons. But I do think it is still incredibly critical that we continue to engage with it. I actually had this woman, she was a teacher who posted something about my book, and I thought it was like, it really stuck with me, where she talked about the fact that a lot of people talk, there's a lot of notions to some extent, or debates within publishing at times about, like, oh, should we be moving away from stories that like show Black pain? Should we move away from stories that focus on any of the sort of those aspects? And, like, in some ways it's like, yes, I see it, because there are a lot of them, and yeah, we have had a lot of narratives that focus on specifically Black suffering, and yeah, at a certain point you don't only want that to be the story. There's so much else in the Black experience that should be shared. But what this teacher said that I thought was really compelling is she said that one of her students read my book, and it was the first time this student learned any of this stuff. It was a Black student, and she, like, didn't know anything. She hadn't learned any of this, and what the teacher really pointed out was, she was like, people have to keep writing these stories, because there are always going to be more young people. There are always going to be people who didn't get the memo. They haven't learned it yet. And therefore, we do have to keep telling the stories. We have to keep sharing the narratives. We have to keep it going.
Yeah, 100%. I agree fully with all of that. I have optimism that we're going to hopefully see, you guys know the Barbra Streisand effect, which is the idea that, so Barbra tried to hide her home from paparazzi, and as a result, they became so much more intensely interested in finding it. I agree with that too. And, and the photos sold for more, and people were more likely to view them. And I do think that hopefully young readers are going to feel, as they should, indignant about what is being kept from them, literature, and exposure that that's being concealed from them. I think that they're going to be inquisitive, and that's going to be a big help. And then, like you said, what you all are doing right now, show up for Black authors, show up for authors who are writing about things that are, that we think are going to be suppressed. Buy the books, tell people about the books, come to the events. I mean, for me, that's one of the biggest things, is, like, if you have a bookstore event, just
buy the books.
Having
really.
people in the audience, like, that is a step toward increasing the reach of any author who's working on this work.
Yeah, and I really will say the buy the books is very real, because the thing about publishing is it's a business. Right. And I do think it's really important to note that, like, yes, we, the writers, we are doing creative work. We are, doing these things, but ultimately, like, we're working with corporations. We're working with businesses who have, bottom lines and stocks and all the stuff, which means that, if they all of a sudden are watching the headlines and they say, oh, they're rolling back DEI, they will roll back publishing Black people. Like, they will do that because they're going to be like, that's not good for our bottom line anymore. Guess that's not what we're doing anymore. So it is really, I think, important to buy the books that you want to see on shelves, because by buying a book, you are saying, I would like more books like this thing on the shelf. You're telling the corporate overlords, you're telling them that that's what we want more of. And I think voting with your dollar does matter.
Hello. I'm big into covers, and the cover of your book is so beautiful. Do you have anything to
tell us about that?
I can take 0 credit for the cover. I have no part. I literally just like said yes or no. So the cover is designed by a woman named Sarah Madden. She is on Instagram, and she's just such an incredible artist. Quite literally, like I said, I have nothing to do with this. She basically read the book, and that's what she came up with. So like that's what happened. I have no other things that I could say. She did such an amazing job capturing the character and capturing the book. It really, really blew me away. I cried when I saw it the first time. I think my agent cried. A lot of people cried. Like a lot of people cried.
Do you get it like a big one frame?
No, I don't have one of those. I wish I did. It would be awesome if somebody gave. It would be great if I had one. I don't know where I'm getting it. Yeah, I don't have one. It does not currently exist. Yeah, but that is the. Yeah, that I don't have that. But this is I take 0. The 2 things that I say that are amazing with my book that I can take absolutely no credit for are the cover artist and the audiobook narrator. The audiobook narrator. If anyone gets the audiobook, like, I would highly recommend listening to the audiobook in some capacity because she did such an amazing job with it. Yeah, she's good.
I absolutely love the book, and I was so excited
Thank
to
you.
be able to introduce it. But I really liked when you talked about how your teaching and your experience as teaching informed your writing. So can you talk just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think I adored being an English teacher. It really was like kind of my dream job. And I'm actually going back on Wednesday to my old school to meet with some of my old students. I'm really excited. But I think my teaching really informed definitely the depiction of like just the adolescence depiction, and really thinking about that, as well as just by being an English teacher, seeing how my students reacted to books and thinking about the kind of books that I know my students would pick up and read, thinking about what they would be, it definitely interwove in some ways with my own curriculum. I used to teach Jesmyn Ward's Sing Unburied Sing. That was like part of my 9th grade curriculum. And that book was a huge influence on this book in many ways. And I think it was because I spent so much time with it all the time, figuring out how to know the ins and outs of that book and make it interesting to my students. And I think one thing I love about that book is that one of the protagonists is a teenager. He's, the main character, Jojo, is its 13th birthday when the book starts. And I've always just been so interested I really enjoy the idea of sort of like more adult books, but that are through the eyes of a teenager, and sort of in that coming of age transition period. So I do think that a lot of my experience is just putting together curriculum, reading books with my students, seeing how my students reacted to books, what their thoughts were. Those really did come together in this. Funny enough, actually, one of my old students has like one of the absolute earliest versions of Junie that possibly exists, because I gave it to her because I had mentioned I was working on a book and it was one of my favorite students, and she was like, "Oh, I want to read it," and I was like, "Okay." And I, maybe not the best decision ever, gave a 14-year-old the book. Have I gotten that back? Sure haven't. Will I ever get it back? Absolutely not. So I'm fine with it. I'm like, Zaria can, she can hold on to that one. Maybe it'll be worth something one day. That's fine. But yeah, my students, it was fun too, because my students always knew I was working on stuff and it was really cool once the book like sold and all this stuff happened, because I got to kind of share a lot of that with my students back in the day.
I just kind of have a comment more like I'm really loud, so I got to hold this far away. Former teacher voice as well.
Yeah,
So,
it's real.
yeah. When you were talking about like how authors introduce like the magical realism and stuff, and I liked how like you didn't really set up for it. It just it was just a part of the book, and it really kind of reminded me of when I read Underground Railroad, Colton
Yeah.
Whitehead's book, where again the railroad, it just was.
Yeah,
That's
it
the way
just
it was. There wasn't like a big introduction, like, oh, you're going to be reading about blah 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 blah. And I really think that just made the book flow better, because it just was. This is what the book is, and this is how it's going to go, and I really enjoyed that. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe I read a good chunk of that book. Not like it was before. I know it was before I started working on Junie, but I do remember a lot. Like, I was definitely very interested in and inspired by the way in which he did that too. That was I really enjoyed that.
I really like historical fiction, and I'm just wondering, like, as an author, what goes into, like, making sure that the language of the book is, like, with the time, like, yeah, like, how does, because it flows so well, but, like, how, it has, there's a lot of research, I'm assuming, that goes into that, right?
There is research. For me, it came about in a few different ways. I think for Junie, for this book, I did a mixture. I did have to sometimes research and look up, like, did they use this phrase? Or, like, was this phrase used a lot? So I think, for example, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think I used the word okay in that entire book. And I think it was because the usage of the word okay starts in some point in the 19th century. And I literally got to a point where I was worried at certain points about, like, well, okay, but they start using it here, but would it have really shown up at that time yet? In this, like, there are little things like that come up a lot. And I had to do some research on just sort of like phrases they used at the time. What is semi-helpful is that like the way in which Black Southern people talk has not changed that much. And I drew a lot from just how my grandparents talked, how my relatives talk. That was helpful. And honestly, like, I'm sure I got stuff wrong. I am certain I did. My copy editors did the best they could, but there's only so much you can really do. Another thing that's super helpful is reading books from the time period. That helps a lot. If you read books that are published around the same time, that can definitely be really useful in getting the language to feel authentic. But yeah, it's one of those, you try to get as close as you can, but the reality is, like, you're never going to be perfect, and you just gotta try to get as close as you can.
Obviously, we all are very excited to have you here today. And while the book obviously centers on Junie, did you have another character that you just loved, that just kind of flowed out of you with this novel?
The other one, maybe Caleb. I think Caleb is always gonna. He's near and dear to my heart. Just sweet little boy. I think. I usually said that, yeah, Violet and Caleb were usually the two who were the easiest for me to write. I think they came together for me most easily on the page. Junie was the hardest one to write. But Caleb, I think, is always the one I think I'll really, like, he's just such a special character to me. And I really enjoyed writing him and sort of, like, sitting with him as a character. And if you haven't read the book, you will learn about Caleb and his whole role in the story.
I think that was our last question, right? So,
so.
Erin, thank you so much.
Thank you so much
this
for
great
coming and having me
conversation.
and for this amazing conversation.